To discuss the IPCC report, Ross Hampton joins me, the CEO of the Australian Forest Production Association. Ross Hampton, thanks very much for your time. Now, in this report, it warns against further abuse of the land and urges a rethink of farming and soil use in order to try and limit global warming. How do you believe your association's members are going to receive this report?
Well, as you know, we've only just received the report. In fact, I've just been listening to the press conference out of Geneva, and I think in a lot of ways Australians working in forest industries right around our nation will say, let's see what else we can do better, but let's see if the rest of the world, or a lot of the rest of the world, can also catch up with the great sustainable forestry practices that are already taking place in Australia. There's a lot we can take from this report, and we certainly are going to consider it in some detail. But we know, and we've known for a long time in Australia, that we have to use the Earth's interest, not the Earth's capital, and that's what sustainable forest management is. That means if we use a tree, we replace a tree.
Now, this report says cutting emissions from vehicles, factories and power plants isn't enough to control rising temperatures, and forestry and farming accounts for about a quarter of man-made greenhouse gas emissions. How is your association and its members addressing these issues already?
You're quite right about that. It says there's more to be done, and also the UN, of course, in its Sustainable Development Goals, makes the point that there's other global challenges of an equal scale, such as housing and feeding 9.5 billion people by 2050, and we have to all work towards making those goals possible. What we're trying to do in Australian forestry and forest industries is ensure that we play our part. It is modest in global terms, but we have a significant part to play in ensuring that we show absolute world's best practice, where we can be real leaders in this space, and we're moving in that direction already. We're uniting with some other parts of the agriculture land use users, and to see what we can do to add trees, which of course store carbon, to primary production in areas where it makes sense, and then increase primary production in Australia, and also increase carbon sequestration through the trees growing and increase wood supply. And that, if done well, can be a global leading movement.
So if you're saying that Australia is already doing well in this area, but let's put on your hat as the Vice Chair of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organisation Advisory Committee on Sustainable Forest-Based Industries. Not all countries are obviously doing well and taking actions like Australia.
This is the really big global challenge, actually, because whilst they're sustainable forest management by definition, and it takes place in not just Australia, other countries also do, it means that we are replacing what we're using. That's not occurring, unfortunately, in many parts of the world. In fact, whilst Australia's forest industries, the people we represent, are certified by one of either or both of the world's global certification schemes, 90% of the world's forests are not certified. And you know, there's something like $30 billion worth of illegal timber floating around the world on ships right at the moment, and some of it's coming into Australia. So we have to, in the UN, when I go to Rome, we talk about what can we do to lift all countries to consider forestry and land use in this same way. The UN itself, the IPCC, has said in previous assessments that forestry done well, sustainably, is actually a very good carbon mitigation strategy. You can get fuel, you can get food, and you can get forest products from a forest, and also continually increase the carbon stocks of the forest if you were doing it well under SFM, Sustainable Forest Management practices and principles. So in Rome, when I do the international meetings, we as a group, and we have concerned leaders from all over the world at these meetings, talk about what we can do to propagate that type of management, forest management, into other countries, and other countries where the economics are much more challenging and where the governance and legal systems aren't necessarily supporting those decisions. In Australia, if we use forested areas, native forestry, we have to, by law, replant and regenerate those forest areas. And unfortunately, that's just not the case in many countries. Well,
with respect to that advisory group, is there any more that can be done than soft diplomacy?
Well, that in the end is up to FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organisation of the UN. The body that I sit on is providing advice. we do think it's time, and I think this report will, as it were, enhance our calls to make these requests ever stronger. The UN has a very difficult role to play, as I'm sure everyone is aware, in trying to move global agreements and global goals at a speed that doesn't lose those places where most of the change has to take place. And so whilst it is frustrating at times, I think they do a very good job. I think the FAO, as we call it, Food and Agriculture Organisation, is doing a good job in moving the world forward at a pace that's manageable. But yes, I think this report will provide further ammunition for our group and others who are advising FAO that the need is urgent and we do need to move forward quickly.
Do you think Australia is being asked to do too much to make up for the inadequacies of other countries?
No, I don't think so. I think that, in fact, we can do more. I think that in relation to, for example, our work in carbon mitigation in Australia, there's enormous opportunity for us to be even greater leaders by example. We could do more with policy that would enable farmers to obtain carbon credits, for example, for adding small amounts of trees to their properties. And we could also work in the built environment to see timber and timber products be provided with carbon credit for the sequestration that's taking place. If you have a timber house, half the weight is stored carbon after all, and none of that's rewarded because there are some complications around it. But the world looks to places like Australia to do the work, to do the hard policy work and provide those leading examples, which are then picked up around the world, especially by countries, as I said, that don't quite have the resources we do to do that sort of work.
Just finally, you launched the 18 by 2030 policy last year, an initiative. Explain that, and how have you seen that being received by the federal government?
This is why we think we can be world leading in terms of working in this space and trying to show a lead both in Australia and internationally in terms of particularly the climate challenge. We gathered together a range of policies such as carbon in the stored environment, for example, and growing more trees, and we added that up and said with the right policy framework, we're confident that Australia has the capacity and the skills and the land and everything's needed to actually add that quantity of carbon sequestration into, as it were, the federal carbon sequestration budget, the goals that we've all signed up to as a nation, and we could do it in by 2030 in the next 10 or 11 or 12 years. We're on that road, we're progressing towards those outcomes. It has to be said that there's still challenges around some of the interactions of some of the policies to ensure that we can really get going on it, but globally that sort of work has been picked up and is being now looked at in some other similar countries to Australia to see if they can't also run with a range of policies that would sequester carbon and help us all as we work in a carbon-constrained global economy.
Ross Hampton, I do thank you very much for your time on ABC News.
Thank you.